This is the lesson on multiplying and dividing rational numbers. Begins on page 69 in your textbook. I want you to look at the activity in the blue box on page 69. Complete patterns A and B of number 1. Pause the video while you're completing that. When you have completed the activity, part 1, then we will talk about the conjectures in number 2 and 3. Number 2, make a conjecture from the patterns that you found in question 1. What seems to be the sign of the product when you multiply a positive number and a negative number? So when the signs are different, what will our product be? Product is negative. Conjecture number 2. From the patterns, what seems to be the sign of the product of two negative numbers? The same thing that happened with two positive numbers. When the signs are the same, product is going to be, the answer is going to be positive. Those are the two conjectures that you can make from the activity on page 69. Turn over to page 70, and we will look at the properties of multiplication. These properties are not new to you. The first one is the identity property of multiplication. The identity property of multiplication. What number can I multiply by that doesn't change its identity? Well, we said 1. So 5 times 1 equals 5. Same identity. In general form, n times 1 will equal n. Second property, multiplication property of 0, page 70 also. What happens when we multiply a number by 0? I hope you said the product is 0. 16 times 0 will equal 0. In general form, n times 0 will equal 0. Multiplication property of negative 1. What happens if I take a number, 6, and I multiply it by negative 1, or the opposite of 1? I end up with the opposite of 6. What happens if I start with the opposite of 7 times the opposite of 1? I get the opposite of 7. Not as confusing, I get positive 7. So a general example, a number times the opposite of 1 will equal the opposite of that number. Not necessarily the negative, because if I start with a negative number, my product will end up being positive. 3 main properties of multiplication that we're looking at today. The rest of page 70 talks about the conjectures that we made based on the activity on page 69. So we're going to move on to applying these properties. And that is on page 71. Evaluating expressions. Let's look at example 3 on page 71. Example 3 talks about using a function. T equals the opposite of 5½ times the quantity A over 1,000 to calculate the change in temperature. For T degrees Fahrenheit and an increase in altitude A that's measured in feet. A hot air balloon starts on the ground and then rises 8,000 feet. What is the change in temperature? they show you the work there. The answer, the change in temperature, is negative 44 degrees Fahrenheit, which means that the temperature fell 44 degrees. Follow along as I'm going to work through, back up on example 2, those quick checks. We will have some application problems, but we're going to try quick check number 2. We have the opposite of the quantity C times D. I can't do any math here until I know the value of C and D. C equals negative 8. D equals negative 7. Now I need to substitute in these values. The opposite of negative 8 times negative 7. Negative 8 times negative 7 is positive 56. The opposite of 56 is negative 56. That would be the answer. Using the same values for C and D, let's substitute in example B. Negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 8 times negative 7. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 negative signs. Because I have an even number of negative signs, I know my answer is going to be positive. Now I just need to multiply. 2 times 3 is 6. 6 times 8 is 48. 48 times 7. 6, carry my 5. 28 plus 5 is 33. 336. Evaluating expressions. You try C on your own. Pause the video as I'm going to move on to simplifying exponential expressions. Example 4. It is important for you to note the difference in example 4 between this notation and this notation. The first one is read the opposite of 3 to the 4th power. The second one is read negative 3 to the 4th power. How are they different? This one, I take 3 times 3 times 3. 3 times 3 is 9. 9 times 3 is 27. Then I apply the opposite sign. So it is the opposite of 27, or negative 27. In this particular case, I'm taking negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. The parentheses mean I'm taking this number inside of the parentheses, negative 3, times itself 4 times. This one doesn't have parentheses, so I'm taking 3 times itself 4 times, and then I'm applying the opposite of that. Oops, I only did 3 threes there. Sorry, this should be the opposite of 81. My error. Negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. Positive 9 times negative 3 is negative 27. Negative 27 times negative 3 is positive 81. Let's look at these additional examples. The opposite of 4 to the 3rd power. So 4 times 4 times 4. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 4, 64. The opposite of 64, so it's negative 64. This one, the quantity negative 2, or negative 2 times itself 4 times. Negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. Negative 2 times negative 2, positive 4. Positive 4 times negative 2, negative 8. Negative 8 times negative 2, positive 16. Negative, the opposite of 3/4 squared. How do I square a fraction? 3/4 squared. It means 3/4 times 3/4. How do I multiply fractions? Straight across. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 4 is 16. Am I done? Look back at this example. It was the opposite of 3/4 squared, so it's going to be the opposite of 9/16. So I put my negative sign in. Lastly, we need to go over some rules for division of fractions. Some things I want you to remember when dividing fractions. If I have 1/2 divided by 2/3, can I divide? We look on page 72 and 73. Just like addition and subtraction are related, because subtraction is really adding the opposite, multiplication and division are related, because division is multiplying by the multiplicative inverse, or the reciprocal. Reciprocal. So remember, instead of keep it, change it, switch it, it's keep it, change it, flip. Keep 1/2. Change division to multiplication. Flip the second fraction, 3/2. Now we just multiply. 1 times 3 is 3. 2 times 2 is 4. The answer is 3/4. Look at example 7 on top of page 73. And we will do quick check number 7 together. Using that same expression, x over y. Evaluate when x equals 8 and y equals negative 4/5. 8 over negative 4/5. That big fraction bar signifies that I should divide. So I'm going to write it differently. 8 divided by negative 4/5. Change it to multiplication and it becomes 8 times negative 5/4. 8 is not a fraction. To turn it into a fraction, I need a denominator of 1. So now I can take 8 times negative 5, negative 40. 1 times 4 is 4. Negative 40 over 4 can be simplified. 4 will go into negative 40 10 times. A negative number divided by a positive number, signs are different, the quotient is negative. My answer is negative 10. Goodbye, Duke.